In the 1950s, deep within the forests of Kenya, a war was raging. Not a war you learned about in school. Not a war Britain wanted the world to see. Villages burned. Men detained without trial. Oaths sworn in secrecy. And a people pushed to the edge, fighting for their land, their dignity, and their freedom. This was the Mau Mau Uprising. And for decades, much of the truth was buried. Today, we uncover it. Long before the British Empire arrived, Kenya was a land of rhythm, community, and deep connection to the earth. Among the Central Highlands, the Kikuyu people lived, farmed, and thrived. Land was not owned in the modern sense. It was inherited, guarded, and passed down through generations. It held stories. It held identity. It held life itself. Pause. But in 1895, everything began to change. The British declared Kenya a protectorate. What followed was not just colonization. It was transformation. By the early 20th century, the most fertile lands in Kenya were no longer in African hands. They had been surveyed, divided, and allocated to European settlers. This region became known as the White Highlands. Rich soil. Cool climate. Perfect for large-scale farming. But there was one problem. People were already living there. Beat. Entire communities were displaced. Families forced out. Some relocated to overcrowded reserves. Others stayed, but as laborers. Working on land that once belonged to their ancestors. Imagine watching your home fenced off. Then being told you could stay, only if you served. Colonial rule did not rely on force alone. It relied on structure. Control was built into everyday life. Africans were required to carry identity passes. Documents that determined where they could go, and when. Failure to produce one could mean arrest. Taxes were introduced. Not to develop, but to compel. Hut tax. Poll tax. And the only way to pay them? Work. Work for the very system that displaced you. Pause. Opportunities in education, business, and politics were tightly restricted. A hierarchy had been established. And at the bottom were the people of the land. By the 1940s, frustration was no longer quiet. It was visible. It was organized. Groups like the Kenya African Union began pushing for reform. Land rights. Representation. Dignity. But the colonial government moved slowly. Too slowly. And for many, peaceful change began to feel impossible. Then came a generation that had seen the world. African soldiers who had fought in World War II. Men who had risked their lives for freedom abroad. They returned home. To find they still had none. In the shadows, something was forming. A movement. Not public. Not political. But powerful. The Mau Mau. At its core, was the oath. Taken in secrecy. Binding individuals to a shared cause. To reclaim land. To resist colonial rule. To remain loyal, even unto death. These ceremonies were deeply symbolic. Sacred to those who participated. But to the colonial authorities, they were seen as dangerous. Even terrifying. And fear often leads to escalation. In October 1952, the colonial government declared a state of emergency. It marked the beginning of open conflict. Thousands were arrested overnight. Political leaders detained. Homes searched. Communities disrupted. Among those arrested, was Jomo Kenyatta. Though his direct involvement with Mau Mau remains debated. His arrest symbolized something larger. The silencing of African political voice. Pause. The narrative was set. This was no longer about grievances. This was war. The forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares became the heart of resistance. Dense. Unforgiving. Alive. Here. Mau Mau fighters organized themselves. Led by figures like Dedan Kimathi. They adopted guerrilla tactics. Ambushes. Night raids. Strategic movement. They lacked resources. But they had knowledge of the land. And a belief. That what they were fighting for, mattered. But the real machinery of the war was not just in them. It was systematic. The British established a network of detention camps. A system often referred to as the pipeline. Suspected Mau Mau supporters were detained. Often without evidence. Without trial. Without end. Inside these camps, conditions were harsh. Labor was forced. Punishments were severe. Interrogations could be brutal. For years, these realities were denied. Minimized. Hidden. Long pause. But history has a way of resurfacing. Outside the camps, another strategy unfolded. Entire populations, especially Kikuyu communities, were relocated into controlled villages. Fenced. Guarded. Monitored. The aim was clear. To isolate the fighters. To break support systems. But the impact was the dismantling of traditional life. To the outside world, the story was simple. The Mau Mau were violent extremists. A threat to order. But missing from that narrative was context. Land loss. Systemic control. Generational frustration. History, told from one side. By the mid-1950s, the uprising began to weaken. Supply lines were cut. Fighters were captured. And in 1956, Dedan Kimathi was arrested. A symbolic end to armed resistance. But not to the idea behind it. The Mau Mau did not win militarily. But they changed the equation. Colonial rule became harder to justify. Harder to sustain. And in 1963, Kenya gained independence. A new chapter began. For decades, the darker aspects of this history remained buried. But in the early 2000s, previously hidden British archives were uncovered. They revealed details of detention camps, of abuse, of deliberate concealment. In 2013, the British government issued an apology and compensated some survivors. A rare acknowledgement. But for many, it raised more questions than answers. The Mau Mau Uprising is not just a chapter in history. It is a mirror. Of power. Of resistance. Of memory. It asks us to look deeper. To question what we are told. And to remember that behind every empire, there are stories that struggle to be heard.